Greetings and welcome to Session 6, Understanding Chord Formulas. My name is Jerry, and I'd like to begin again by reminding you that the primary goal of this learning series, entitled How Chords Are Formed and Used for Absolute Beginners, is obviously to get you forming chords as soon as possible. And now, as we inch closer to Session 8, where it all comes together, we now have learned several valuable pieces of the chord forming puzzle where we will be able to understand how chords are formed and named. As you can see in our map, this will remind us of where we have been, where we are, and where we are going. Although I have already referenced and used chord formulas and examples in previous sessions, there is other detailed information to share about them, such as their association with chord types, where chord formulas can be found, and how chord formulas are used in forming and naming chords. And I want to say now that the one thing you need to know and remember is that for every type of chord, there is a unique, one-of-a-kind chord formula. And without having chord formulas, learning to form chords for an absolute beginner is like learning to fly an airplane without wings. So coming up in Session 7, not only will you learn all the different chord types, you will also see their affiliated chord formulas, which I'm sure you're anxious to get to. Until then, be a bit more patient and let's discover some additional attributes about chord formulas you probably won't get exposed to elsewhere that I think are important to know and will help you connect the dots at the right time. Now, please allow me to begin with a personal story that I hope you find both interesting and encouraging. In my early days of playing garage band rock and roll music without formal piano lessons, my first time ever to sit on a piano bench was with Ken Musnug, the lead guitar player that had invited me to join a band known as Us Incorporated. Although Ken knew I had never played the piano, he assumed my musical experience in the high school band playing baritone was enough to get me started. Well, it was, but barely. So how did we start? Well, we went to the piano and he taught me if that you played certain notes at the same time, it would make a chord. So he played each of the three notes of a C major chord on his guitar, while I pecked around to match those notes on an old, rather out-of-tune upright piano in a cold basement. That's where and how I began my piano playing. So he asked me to find this note, and I did, which ultimately I learned was a C note. Then he played another note that, not this one, but it sounded right there, which became an E note. And then lastly, we found the third note to be a G note. So we found the C, E, and G note to be the three notes of a C major chord. And that's how we started. But obviously, I had no clue there was such a thing as chord formulas back then. And there was no connection to anything else other than me just memorizing these three specific note combinations or finger shapes, as many beginners still do. So you learning about chord formulas early on as an absolute beginner will give you a great edge in your journey. With this as a backdrop, be sure you know and appreciate just how important chord formulas really are. As we get into them, you might think of chord formulas as, quote, numerical patterns used to define note intervals to form any chord in any key signature. Thus, these different note intervals are what makes the different chords sound different. Chord formulas allow the musician a constant and repeatable resource to form any chord you might need to play without having to memorize all the note interval combinations, which is a very important feature. For example, to form and play a major chord in all 12 key signatures without having the major chord formula at hand, you would need to memorize the following note combinations. Wow, look at all those. Certainly doable, but a pretty daunting task. And remember, this is for only one type of chord. So rather than spending an inordinate amount of time memorizing each of these different chord note combinations, all you need to know is the chord formula of a major chord, which is, quote, spelled as note position numbers 1, 3, and 5, and their equivalent semitone count numbers of 0, 4, 7. So any memorizing required is of the one chord formula for a major chord rather than all the individual note name combinations. What an important difference. Much like any formula in any field of study, chord formulas in music define exactly which notes are needed to form a specific type of chord as just described. But more than that, understand that chord formulas express the chord's root position, meaning the chord name is identified by the note name appearing in the very left or first position. In other words, if the chord name is a C major chord, its root position would start the chord notes with a C note. What? This is huge. Let me repeat. Chord formulas define exactly which notes are necessary to form any chord in its root position in any key signature using note position numbers. So this means I don't have to peck around or guess or memorize finger shapes anymore. Wow again. And even better news, chord formulas, because they are formulas, are constant and never change, meaning there are no exceptions to remember, which also means the intervals between notes never change. By the way, when you see or hear the term chord spelling, this is another acceptable term for the term chord formula, as I just mentioned that term a few minutes ago. From yet another perspective, chord formulas, generally speaking, illustrate just how much music theory is mathematically structured rather than being some random series of notes and intervals. And whether a musician knows it or not, whatever chord he or she plays on whatever instrument they are played on, they are playing chords that are defined by some chord formula. And just because the musician doesn't know what the chord formula is doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Nor, on the other hand, it doesn't mean the musician can't play those chords, as lots of musicians I know are good players without knowing chord formulas. But the point here is that musicians who may have learned to form chords by ear and or memorization only likely have a more limited path in understanding all the connections and relationships that are going on in music. And repeating one more time, remember there is only one specific and unique chord formula for each different chord type, as we will see in the next session. And if you think about it, the chord formula for any specific chord type does not care what letter chord name you are wanting to form. The chord formula simply expresses the intervals between chord notes and is applied to any chord letter name you wish to form. So whether you want to form a C, an E flat, an F sharp chord, or any chord letter starting note, the note intervals of the chord type being formed remain the same. Said another way, there are no two chord formulas that are exactly alike. However, you might find it interesting, and we'll soon learn that several chord formulas only differ by one note interval, which may seem to be a seemingly small detail, but is actually what provides the distinct and unique footprint tones and musical flavors of each type of chord. So does one semitone note interval distance make a huge difference in the tones we actually hear in chords? Oh, you bet it does. Thus, Chord formulas represent the origin of where all chords began their life. Although I've used a few examples of what chord formulas look like in previous sessions, let's look again to be sure we are on the same page. Here's a random sample of 3 typical chord formulas and what they mean. 1, 3, and 5, 1, flat 3 and 5, 1, 3, 5, and a flat 7. Each one of these chord formula examples identify the individual notes to form a specific type of chord. And again, we'll learn these and many more in Session 7 with their respective chord types and their formulas. As we now know, chord formulas list the first 3 note position numbers of some, quote, triad chord type. For example, the 1, 3, 5 represents the triad, as well as the root note position numbers for forming a major chord type, as we now have seen in several examples. But now, something new. A 1, flat 3, 5 chord formula represents another common triad chord type, but it is that of a minor chord type. As you can see, the, quote, minor chord type identifies a change in the middle number using a flat 3 note position number rather than just a 3. Although only one semitone different, what a difference it makes in the sound. In our third example here, if a chord contains more than 3 notes, the formula still identifies the triad notes first, but then adds other note position numbers as necessary. So in our example here, the chord formula of 1, 3, 5, flat 7 include the triad note position numbers of 1, 3, and 5 listed first, and then the flat 7 note position number is added. And as stated earlier, any chord formula can be applied to any starting note as the 1 root position note because the formula doesn't care what letter chord you're wanting to form. Repeating again, using chord formula numbers rather than actual letter note names eliminates having to memorize every note of every possible letter name, chord name, which would be a very large task. So for now, at least you have a general idea of what chord formulas look like. Now let me share where chord formulas can be found. They are scattered across the internet by searching the keyword, quote, chord formulas or, quote, chord spelling. Just be warned, however, that requesting only the term chord formula may also lead you quickly to some highly technical information about chord formulas rather than finding specific chord formulas themselves for specific chord types. But try it just to explore the world of chord formulas. But if you make your search request a bit more specific, such as, quote, what is the chord formula for a C major chord, you will get its chord formula information rather quickly and may also lead you to other chord types and chord formulas. But remember that at this moment, your search requests are limited because you don't yet know what chord type names to search for. Again, this is coming up in Session 7. However, there are other easier resources for identifying specific chord formulas. One of my favorite internet sites is 8notes.com. That's 8notes.com, where you can search chords by letter name and by chord name or chord type to see the exact notes required for a particular chord. Of course, this is possible because of and is proof again that individual chords and their notes are simply created by mathematical combinations of note intervals. Another computer resource is, quote, Chordy app. That's CHORDIE-APP, which is a computer software program that is connected from the USB port of any keyboard to a computer, which instantly shows the name or names of chords as soon as multiple notes are played, which can help all of us grasp a deeper understanding of identifying chords. Another similar product is known as Classroom Maestro. But even with all this technology, I created my own one-page, one-sided document entitled Chord Types and Formulas, the Best Cheat Sheet Ever. If you're interested in obtaining this PDF you may contact me at pianochordcoach@gmail.com for instructions on how to get one for your own personal use. So as a beginner in this musical journey, when you feel overwhelmed, isn't it nice to know that 99% of the chord formulas you'll ever need to form and play chords to can be condensed to a one-page, one-sided sheet of paper? I still keep mine around as my favorite resource, especially when confronted with not so often played chords, as it is an easy, user-friendly, and quick reference. Lastly, let me give you some opinionated comments about what chord formulas are not. For example, in my opinion, some of the learning quote tricks presented by online music teachers about forming chords are less than transparent for absolute beginners. For me, the classic teaching example found time and time again suggests that forming chords using white notes can be done by simply skipping every other note. But what's not explained is that this skipping notes business only applies to 3 of the major diatonic chords, specifically in the key signature of C major, which are the chords C, F, and G, a very small portion of all possible chords. By the way, the term diatonic simply means, quote, belonging together, a term we will explore in later sessions. And yes, one might argue that the C major key signature is so often used that this, quote, skipping trick makes sense to teach. But for me, only if the rest of the story is disclosed, as the key signature of C major is the exception, not the rule. Well, why is this the exception? Because there are 14 other possible major key signatures this, quote, chord skipping trick does not work in. So what other chord forming trick would they show you for those? Unfortunately, I don't ever recall hearing a teacher prominently addressing this issue. Statistically, then, it seems to me that 3 out of 14 would be considered a mathematical exception, not the rule. And before I get called out, this skipping, quote, every other note business using only the white keys does generate other chord types, specifically 3 minor chords and 1 diminished chords. But now this is where skipping notes can get confusing very quickly and is unnecessary, the very reasons I don't recommend using it. All we need are chord formulas. And one other comment about what forming chords is not. I hear many music teachers suggesting that a beginner, quote, hear the correct note or notes to form a chord. This may be a natural-born talent some folks have without formal ear training, but I would think statistically most absolute beginners have not discovered or acquired this talent yet. In this context, think about the following. Wouldn't an absolute beginner feel somewhat incompetent if he or she were made to believe they needed pitch or ear training to even get started in learning piano? I've heard comments many times from musicians insinuating that you need to have, quote, good ears to play the piano. In my opinion, not true. Musical hearing is and can be a learned skill. And wouldn't an absolute beginner feel even more unqualified and intimidated after trying repeatedly to hear correct chord notes but realize they are not good at it? How deflating would this be early on in their learning process? So again, all we need is chord formulas. And to clarify my position, I certainly support ear training, but believe that learning to use chord formulas as a resource and tool to form chords first helps develop pitch hearing, not the other way around. So as you progress, let your technical know-how of forming the correct notes of chords teach your ear through repetition and practice. The information provided in this session is another technical piece of the music theory puzzle, and as you continue applying these resources, you will subconsciously and automatically begin memorizing chord formulas without working at it or even thinking about them much. Chord formulas will mentally become second nature to you, and you'll find your need to, quote, look them up less and less frequent. So congratulations, you now have another important piece of knowledge and resources necessary to fully understand chords. And now a look ahead. In our next session, Session 7, Introduction to Chord Types, we'll dive into the fun stuff of learning the names of the different types of chords and their chord formulas. This is likely the session that you wanted to start with from the beginning, but now the waiting is almost over. And now, because of this, you are way ahead of most absolute beginners and many veteran musicians. And as always, thank you for your time and attention. Please subscribe if you found this session helpful in your music theory journey as an absolute beginner.